So having looked at the atrial chambers, we can turn our attention to the first of the junctions between the so-called segments of the heart, and that of course is the junction between the atrial chambers and the ventricular chambers. So in this heart I'm showing you here the atrioventricular junction, specifically the right atrioventricular junction. Now as we look at this atrioventricular junction, you can see that it is the point where the atrial myocardium enters the vestibule of the tricuspid valve, but stops short of the crest of the muscular ventricular septal mass. And here, filling the inferior atrioventricular groove, we have the fibro-fatty tissue of the right atrioventricular junction, containing within it the branch of the right coronary artery. As you see at the atrioventricular junction, the hinge line of the atrioventricular valve, the tricuspid valve, is coincident with the point where the ventricular myocardium stops short of the atrial myocardium. And of course there is insulation here between the atrial muscle mass and the ventricular muscle mass, because in the normal heart the only muscular structure crossing this insulation provided at the atrioventricular junction is the bundle of His. And we'll look at that in the fullness of time. But let's now look at this right atrioventricular junction that supports the leaflets of the tricuspid valve. This heart shows us very nicely the three leaflets of the tricuspid valve. And we can see that one of them is directly adjacent to the ventricular septum. And the feature of this particular leaflet is the multiple tendinous cords that attach it to the ventricular septum. The second of the leaflets, positioned anterosuperiorly, hangs down as a curtain between the inlet and the outlet of the right ventricle, and we'll look at that in a little more detail very shortly when we look at the overall structure of the right ventricle. This heart shows us very nicely, however, the third leaflet of the tricuspid valve. And as you see, when I open the heart in attitudinally appropriate fashion, this leaflet is inferiorly positioned within the right atrioventricular junction. It is often called the posterior leaflet, but that is incorrect. When we look at the heart in attitudinally appropriate fashion, it is the septal leaflet that is the most posterior of the three leaflets of the tricuspid valve, with this leaflet, the third leaflet, being inferiorly positioned. And as you can see, it is also the inferior papillary muscle that supports the zone of apposition between this inferior leaflet and the septal leaflet. So that, guarding the right atrioventricular junction, we have the tricuspid valve with its septal, anterosuperior, and inferior leaflets. I've changed hearts to show you the left atrioventricular junction, because this heart illustrates in much more beautiful fashion the structure of the crucially important mitral valve. But what I can show you, having opened the left atrioventricular junction through its posterior margin, is that again the junction itself is the point where the atrial myocardium stops short of the crest of the muscular left ventricular mass. As we look at this junction, however, we can see now that there are two vascular structures in the left atrioventricular junction. One of those is the artery, the circumflex artery. The other is the great cardiac vein, which accompanies the circumflex artery and then drains inferiorly, as we see here, into the coronary sinus. As we look at the left atrioventricular junction, however, which again marks the point where we start the ventricular mass, we can see that the junction is coincident with the hinge line of the atrioventricular valve. And once more, there is insulation here between the atrial myocardium and the ventricular myocardium, so that, to emphasize again, in the normal heart, the only muscular structure crossing this plane of insulation is the bundle of His. Now, if I spread the left atrioventricular junction, then you see beautifully the structure of the mitral valve. We see that unlike the right atrioventricular junction, there are only two leaflets guarding this left atrioventricular junction, and the leaflets have marked dissimilarity in their structure. The larger leaflet guards only 1/3 of the overall circumference of this left atrioventricular junction, and we call this leaflet the aortic leaflet, because as I turn the heart round, you see that this leaflet, on its ventricular aspect, is in direct fibrous continuity with two of the leaflets of the aortic valve. If I turn back to the inlet aspect, we then see that the other leaflet of the valve, which I have transected so as to open the junction, guards 2/3 of the overall valvular circumference, but is much shorter than the deep aortic leaflet of the mitral valve. So that although the two leaflets, this, the aortic leaflet, the second one, the mural leaflet, called the mural leaflet because it is attached here from the wall of the left ventricle, although they guard dissimilar proportions of the overall valvular circumference, they are of comparable area, and they fit together snugly when the valve is in its closed position. Now, when the valve is in its closed position, there is only a solitary zone of apposition between these two leaflets. At the moment, we call the ends of this zone of apposition the commissures, but in reality, a commissure is a zone of junction between two component parts. So we must remember that the points we call the commissures are no more than the ends of the solitary zone of apposition between the aortic and the mural leaflets of the mitral valve. What we can see very nicely, however, is that the papillary muscles of the valve, and as I've already told you, the papillary muscles with the heart in attitudinally appropriate position are positioned inferiorly and septally, superiorly and laterally. As we see, the papillary muscles give their tendinous cords to each of the leaflets, so that the leaflets, the tendinous cords, support the two ends of the solitary zone of apposition between the aortic and the mural leaflet of the mitral valve.